You obviously have a lot of experience in markets. The past few months have been quite unusual, where we see, individually maybe no move is that odd. Stocks going down, bond yields going up, currency going down, but at the same time, it's been quite strange. What do you think is happening? What's driving that?
You think it's unusual, what's going on out there? No, I'm kidding. Yeah, look, it's obviously been very strange. It's been very volatile. I'd like to think, well, predicting stock markets and things like that is always unbelievably difficult, and nobody gets it right more than kind of 51% of the time. Now we're being asked as investors to predict what's going to come out in the latest tweet or the latest Rose Garden appearance or latest comment in the Oval Office when he's greeting some foreign leader. And it really is very, very tough for us to focus. And look, the economy is clearly slowing down. People are I think we have some slides. Are we going to put those up there, or what are we going to do with them?
So we've seen a downgrade in growth forecast.
There we go.
Yeah.
That's what I was looking for. So, I like charts, and I think, pictures worth 1,000 words and all that, so you get fewer words and more charts. So what this basically shows you is what's been happening. These are Goldman Sachs' projections, but if you look at probably any of the major forecasters or investment banks, you'd see something similar, which is back what they thought in 2020, which was that growth would stay between 2 and 2.5%, which was ironically where it was at the end of the Biden administration when Trump said it was an economic disaster. And then you can see that they've been slowly downgraded and downgraded. And right now, I think the conventional wisdom, which I wouldn't disagree with, is that there's 50 to 60% chance that we're going to have a recession. Clearly, consumers are slowing down. We can go to the next slide if you want.
Yeah.
There we go. So if you look at consumer sentiment on the left, this is the black. Let's focus on the black line for a second. This is the lowest reading of consumer sentiment, except for 1 month in the whole time that they've collected this data. You can also see all the way on the left that when Donald Trump left in 2020, right before COVID anyway, we were at 100, and now you can see how far down we are. What's interesting also on the left, and it's going to be true on the right in a second, is that what you think depends a lot on who you voted for. You can see that back during Trump 1.0, more Republicans were optimistic than Democrats more optimistic. Now it's flipped around. Republicans are more optimistic and Democrats are very, very pessimistic. But on average, people are, as I said, at a record level of pessimism. And on the right, you can see a large part of why, which is inflation. And that the average American thinks inflation is going to be 6 or 7% in the coming year. That's not what the professionals think, but it's in a way more important what consumers think because it affects their behavior. And again, you can see the same political thing where it's sort of flipped around after the election. And so basically, people are pulling back. People are not going to spend money right now. And you see this, we're just starting to get first quarter earnings reports from public companies, and they're all basically saying consumers are pulling back. They're not sure what's going to happen. And they just don't want to spend money, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So
not to be too obvious, to hit this too hard in the head, but what exactly is actually driving this change in behavior? Because as we can see, it's very sudden just over the past couple of months. So what kind of specific policy changes do you see causing all this?
I think it's a mix of two things. I think in terms of specific policies, it's tariffs, tariffs, and tariffs. I don't think most Americans had ever heard of tariffs before, and here's tariffs, had ever heard of tariffs before this election campaign and then Trump's arrival. He did some tariffs in his first term. Biden took some of them off and put some others on, but it really wasn't in the consciousness. This is the average tariff rate on all of our imports. And you can see that essentially in the post-war world, the world decided that fewer tariffs were better than more, that free trade was a good thing, that it allowed consumers to get cheaper, better products from other places. And so it went down, 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 and it was about 2.5%. You can see all the way on the right before it jumps up, you see a little upturn during Trump 1.0 and a little downturn during Biden, who took some of them off, as I said. And now you can see where we are. We're back to roughly 1909 levels. Many of you probably studied the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in school. People sometimes, as a shorthand, say they caused the Depression. They didn't cause the Depression, but I think every economist pretty much, except at the very fringes, would tell you that they significantly exacerbated the Depression. So you can see they came down, down, down. And so tariffs, I think, are the biggest thing. The second thing is just the uncertainty, that every day something different happens. The stock market has been unbelievably volatile. I can't remember volatility like this in the recent past anyway. And so I think it just makes people very destabilized and uncertain. And when you're uncertain, you pull back.
So the argument that you hear from the administration officials, I mean, we just heard Steve Moran a couple minutes ago, is that we should look through this, that actually the tariffs are going to ultimately be better for American companies by improving the competitiveness of making things in the United States. Why do you think markets disagree with that?
Well, if that were true, you would have CEOs out there basically saying this is a really great idea and we're really glad you're putting tariffs on. But other than a few people who have found some self-serving piece of it that they want for their own particular business, no CEO that I know of is saying that. They're all saying this is really bad. And what's also bad about them is they're indiscriminate, that it's basically across-the-board tariffs on everything. You know, he started with tariffs on steel and aluminum. Well, if you want to make stuff here and you raise the price of steel and aluminum here, it makes us less competitive, not more competitive. So if some car parts guy out in Ohio, he's got to pay more for his steel, more for his aluminum. And so if you really wanted to just sort of target some industries and say we want to develop these industries here, and by the way, Alexander Hamilton was in favor of that if you read his report on manufacturers, that when you have young industries, maybe semiconductors is a good example of that, tariffs are not crazy, but to put them on across the board, I mean, why do we have 54% tariffs on Lesotho? I mean, what has Lesotho done to us that justifies tariffs at that level?
That's right. And I think one thing interesting is the way the reciprocal tariffs have been temporarily paused, right? And yet, nevertheless, the tariffs on China are now incredibly high. And as you mentioned, some of the things we import from China, maybe you could argue the national security case is why you'd want to import less. But at the moment, anyway, there's an extremely high dependence on the imports, for certain kinds of goods, including the things that are in no way national security, like toys, for example. I mean, again, I'm just trying to, not that you are crafting administration policy, maybe you could walk through
I'm certainly not crafting administration policy. I don't want anyone to think I am, because I would disassociate myself.
Absolutely, but I mean, just walk through kind of how that.
Look, China is a really tough case. We have done a lot of investing in China. I go there once or twice a year. I am both admiring of what they've accomplished and not happy about some of the ways they've accomplished it. They are not fair actors. They use government subsidies. They use other kinds of what we call non-tariff barriers, ways to restrict other countries or other companies competing with them, and so forth. But that said, what they have accomplished, their ability to produce things. I'll give you an example. I worked on cars at one point, and the Chinese were never really good at building cars. Well, now they are. BYD builds cars that are viewed as being at least as good as our electric cars, and at a fraction of the price. Now, we have 100% tariff on Chinese cars, so there aren't going to be any BYD cars here. But they got a big market share in Europe before Europe put tariffs on them. And they're really good. I mean, the Chinese people work really hard. They don't get paid a lot. And I'm a capitalist, but there's something sometimes to be said for state-directed capitalism, because they can focus on an industry and basically say, we're going to. But in any event, this chart, so when you want to talk about what consumers are going to feel, it's not just going to be prices. This country could feel, and I'm going to exaggerate slightly, kind of like the Soviet Union in the 1970s, where you go into stores and there are empty shelves, because all this stuff on the left is stuff that we either don't make here at all, or we make here in very, very small quantities. Obviously, iPhones, people get a lot of attention, but we get to Christmas and toys, and 90% of our toys, and bicycles aren't on here, but it's the same for bicycles, are made somewhere else, and you can see a lot of them are made in China, not just China. Things like shoes and clothes, Vietnam and places like that have become very good at making that kind of stuff. But that's what we're facing. So it's not just price, and I thought we were going to say that Steve Myron talked about how it's only 14% of our GDP, but it's all this stuff.
Right.
That either people aren't going to be able to get it all. Oh, so China. So look, China, we're really in a death struggle with China on this. And I know Trump today or yesterday said, well, we're going to do some stuff and it's going to be okay with China, and I want to talk to Xi, but Xi doesn't want to talk to him at the moment. Look, China's attitude is a bit like, we're big boys now. We have a GDP that on a PPP basis is as big as yours. We're not going to get pushed around by you. And when Vance called them a bunch of peasants, that didn't really help anything. And so it's a bit of a death struggle there, and I'm not sure how that one ends. Nobody's going to buy anything from China with 154% tariff on it. It's just not going to do it.
I want to get back to you talking about cars, because as you said, you have some real experience there. And one thing that's been interesting is that unlike some of the other tariffs that are on all goods, there's specific sectoral tariffs on cars and parts. And when those were announced, you saw two things that were interesting. One is that American headquartered car companies, so Ford and GM, the stock price did not react well. And you also saw the head of the United Auto Workers Union praising the tariffs. So maybe you can kind of explain, the dynamics there and, how you think it's all going to play out.
The president of the UAW hated the car tariffs. Loved the car tariffs, but hated all the other tariffs. Kind of where you stand is kind of where you sit, or the other way around. But in any event, there's a lot of self-serving stuff. Look, I don't think the car companies particularly like the tariffs. The U.S. car companies, GM and Ford and Stellantis, if you want to think of them as a U.S. company, because what this chart shows, and I'm not sure the president fully understood this, is that when we had, after NAFTA, when we basically had free trade with Canada and Mexico, companies, and not just car companies, sourced stuff wherever it was cheapest. And so a lot of car stuff gets made in Canada, a lot gets made in Mexico, and one of the things I learned in my car experience is that the Mexicans build, as workers, build really good cars. They're very good workers, and they get paid a tenth of what our auto workers get paid. So a lot of production, even for GM and Ford, has moved south of the border. And what this shows, which I also didn't know until I got in the car business, is that as you make a car, parts go back and forth across the border multiple times. Like a steering wheel assembly, the steering wheel might get made in Canada, the shaft might get made in Mexico, then it goes somewhere else, and they add another piece, and it goes back and forth like that. And so why the car company stocks have not reacted well is because this is going to increase their costs as well as the costs for other car companies.
And the UAW didn't know that? What's the...
Well, the UAW is focused on jobs in the U.S., and it is true that if you put tariffs on imports into the U.S., you are going to create more jobs in the U.S., but you're going to do that at the expense of car prices being higher for American consumers. And so there were studies done, like, for example, on the steel tariffs that Trump put in Trump 1.0, and I don't remember the number, but it was hundreds of thousands of dollars per job saved. And so we can't deal with special pleadings. And I have a lot of affection for the car industry, but we can't have every consumer in America pay more, frankly, just for some car workers.
Right. So, last question. One of the arguments that has not been as made explicitly, but maybe is a motivation for these tariffs. If you do this sort of back the envelope math and you say, okay, goods imports are about 11% of GDP, the tariff rate we showed earlier is about 26%, it's a tax increase, assuming no change in goods imports volumes, is something like 2 percentage points of GDP, which, given the size of the budget deficit of 6% of GDP, that's a meaningful amount. And I wonder to what extent Republicans in Congress might be thinking, well, we don't have the political capital to do the kinds of spending cuts necessary to really contract the budget deficit in a meaningful way, or tax increases for that matter. So this is sort of a, to keep their hands clean. What's sort of your view on that?
So the idea is we're going to add a couple of points to inflation, put the country into a recession in order to raise some revenue to deal with what you're seeing on the screen here. Look, we went away from tariffs and instituted a federal income tax in 1913, plus or minus, because it was recognized that tariffs are highly regressive. They hurt people at the bottom more than at the top. They're not a good way to collect revenue. And we basically, over the last 100 years, have made that substitution. And so to go back seems crazy to me. We do have a huge budget problem. This is, I guess, our last point in our final 30 seconds. And frankly, there's no courage on Capitol Hill, certainly among the Republicans, to do anything about it. The green bars are what the deficit would be on kind of present course and speed on the right side of the chart. And the blue is what the House passed, which was $2.8 billion, as you see on the left in the red, of additional, $200 trillion, over 10 years, of additional debt. And then the Senate kind of piled on and said, well, let's make it $5.8 trillion. And so the amount of additional deficits and debt that the Republicans on the Hill at the moment have provided for dwarfs all these other plans here. In fact, you can add most of them up together and you still won't get to $5.8 trillion. All the stuff that the Republicans, sorry for ending on a partisan note, but all the stuff the Republicans bash the Democrats about, the IRA and the infrastructure bill and all this American Rescue Plan, all that stuff adds up to less than what they're talking about doing now. And look, this is the biggest, not to end so much on such a down note, but this could be our biggest existential problem at the moment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.